So I did have a little bit of Everclear earlier, but I did not drink a shit ton just because this stuff is potent. Before I mix it tomorrow or in a couple of hours, I gotta have at least one shot. It's the weekend.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 209 on this fine February weekend or weekday, depending on when I actually finish the fucking episode. But yeah, alright, hey everybody, calm down. Like, I know we're all excited for AlphaCon next weekend. But you gotta do your chores before you get your allowance to go buy Game Boy games or whatever the fuck. And so, I am here talking to you fine folks about a death metal band named Supuration from France. Now, I'm sure most of us are familiar with your French black metal bands, you know, your Peste Noires, your Mutilations, maybe if you're a little bit less cool, your Deathspell Omegas. But they had a death metal scene back in the day, and it was full of a lot of bands that were very weird, like Loud Blast and Aggressor, and the weirdest of the bunch, the one we're talking about today, Supuration with one P, not to be confused with Supuration with two Ps. That was a death metal band in the Ukraine that turned into Nocturnal Mortem. Now, technically, in English, you spell the word Supuration with two P's, so the Ukrainians got the right of that. But in French, I believe the same word is spelled with just one P. It means a big old pile of goop and bacteria from a dead tissue breakdown. Basically, it's a fancy word for pus, and it's a good name for a fucking death metal band. So Supuration, the French one, started way back in like the late 80s. They did a bunch of demos, and they went through a process that I like to call the old school death metal transition. Rather than simply describe what this transition is to you, I can give you an example of the band Dismember, who I'm sure you're all much more familiar with than Supuration, doing the same sort of thing. So here's the first Dismember demo, and honestly, unless you recognize the song Defective Decay that they re-recorded later on, you might not even be able to tell that this is Dismember. It sounds not much at all like their later material, but then they bring that song back on the third demo, and now this is clearly Dismember. They have the chainsaw guitar tone, they have the more like groove-based drumming, the vocals are much closer to what they would be on the albums. It's Dismember. That's the old school death metal transition. At a certain point in every old school death metal's demo lifespan, they switch from sounding like a bad Sepultura clone from Brazil in like 1987 to actually sounding like what they sort of end up sounding like on the album, albeit in a more primitive form. Supuration did the same thing. Their earlier demos are almost kind of like black thrash sounding. The guitars aren't as down-tuned. They don't have like the big buzzy sound they would become famous for later. And the only real inkling you would have that these guys would end up being like a really big progressive death metal band is the rhythmic complexity of the music with all the time changes and shit. Even for like, you know, late 80s death metal, this is pretty fucking out there. But then you get to like the first proper Supuration demo, because they initially had like a whole bunch of different names for their band before they settled on Supuration, and you get what Supuration would kind of actually become famous for, sort of. The tape hiss is gone, the guitar sound is more professional and death metal sounding, but more importantly, they start doing shit like this. Incorporating keyboards and these weird, like, wandering lead guitar melodies. This is the beginnings of what would actually become the Supuration that some of us know and love today. It's still much more like normal death metal sounding than their, you know, like album material. But you can hear inklings of what Supuration would become, particularly when the lead guitar shit like this happens, because lead guitar would be incredibly important for Supuration later on the albums. Here, it's not quite as integral to the structure of the music, but it's still pretty, you know, out there, weird and spacey for like 1990 death metal, which is when this came out. And of course, there is Some dank old school death metal breakdowns. I just had to include that one because it sounds fucking cool, you know, dun, 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 picking up change. We like that kind of stuff. But the main thing to take away from this demo is that weird, spacey, wandering lead guitar and the really thick rhythm guitar tone. That would become hallmarks of their performances on the full lengths. But here we get into a pretty big sea change, not just for Supuration, not just for death metal, but metal in general. Because Supuration were one of the first avant-garde metal bands. It might not have sounded like that on the demos, but hear me out. Okay, avant-garde metal basically starts mostly in France, mostly from bands on a label called Holy Records that was actually owned by the main guy behind the band Misanthrope, who are like one of like the most important, historically at least, avant-garde metal bands. Supuration actually predates all of that, even their first album does, but they ended up getting signed to Holy Records pretty much as soon as it started. I've been thinking about doing a Holy Records episode, but it'd probably end up being kind of tricky because each of the bands that I really like on that label, I could do a whole episode on. In fact, most of those bands have like a single album that I could talk about for 20 minutes. So that's probably what I'm going to end up doing, and that's kind of why I'm doing this episode, because we're mostly going to be talking about the first Supuration album here. But to talk about that album, I mean, you heard those demos. It was great death metal, but it wasn't very avant-garde. How do you turn into avant-garde metal pioneers? Well, what you do is you take some inspiration from your French-speaking cousins from across the Atlantic Ocean over in Quebec, and you get really into this band called Voivod. If you haven't heard Voivod, here's a little clip. So these guys actually started out as a very fast and dirty, messy-sounding thrash metal band back in the pioneering days of that genre. But by the time their third album came out, they had gotten completely weird and strange. They were big on these really long, like kind of classical music influenced intros, leading into some very dissonant and strange guitar work, pretty much unlike anything else going on at the time in metal. You get these like weird like squawking noises, odd, strange, dissonant chords. They were heavily influenced by punk bands like Chrome and Die Kreuzen. And when you work that back into a more metal context, you get these like super dissonant guitar riffs that ended up influencing everybody from Immolation to Averse Sephira to Time Gold, Vector. But then they have these like really soulful kind of choruses that are very melancholic sounding, despite, you know, the obvious like nasty thrash type shit that's going on. That's what Voivod brings to the table before they end up going on and turning into like a full-on prog rock band by the early 90s. And those sort of epic build-ups combined with the highly dissonant guitar playing and the odd intrusions of melancholy into overall chaotic material proved to be a big influence on Supuration. Supuration technically not the first band to start incorporating Voivod type shit into death metal. The earliest one of those that I can think of would be another Quebecois band that probably also influenced Supuration a lot called Oblivion. That's like Oblivion with Eon at the end instead of Ion, you know what I mean. What's odd about these guys, despite the fact that they're much more death metal-y than Voivod, they're a little bit more pleasant sounding. There's still the weird guitar playing, but it has a more consonant melodic cast to it than the sort of like very punk influenced nastiness of Voivod. And it leads to like even more in-depth usage of these very long song intros. A lot of times the vocals don't show up for quite a bit into the song. This is the truncated version, and we still haven't heard any vocals for like the first 30 seconds at least. Also, the song's like 9 minutes long. And they have all these like full stops. That would be important for Supuration. All these full stops that lead into like new weird sections of music. There's the death metal vocals. I told you they were going to happen. But yeah, no, this is a lot more rounded around the edges and polished than the very nasty, messy murk of 80s Voivod. And that level of polish allows them to experiment with instrumental separation and layers of sound more than Voivod could do back in the 80s. Obviously, this band also influenced Vector and Droid and all that a lot. But that's sort of the groundwork for getting Supuration to jump from just being like kind of a strange death metal band with weird bits of melody and groove into being like a really crazy avant-garde sort of death metal band. What that looks like on their first album, The Cube, which is sort of like a weird concept album that's continued its concept over the course of every Supuration album, is an even heavier focus on very long, mostly instrumental intros. In fact, instead of being like, here's a big big instrumental chunk of that first part of the song. Instead, they'll like have a whole little mini song that introduces some of the themes that'll become important for like the larger song that comes immediately afterwards. In fact, they often fade into each other. It's very Wagnerian in a sense. Some of the songs are very much towards that Voivod dissonant mold, such as the 1-2 punch of the shorter intro song Soul's Speculum going into the longer song 1308.jp.08. I told you they were prog. They got weird fucking song titles. That's not even the only letters and numbers one on here. So the shorter sort of Vorspiel style track starts out with a pretty pleasant sounding guitar tone. And then they bring in those buzzy, nasty Entomb guitars and proceed to completely muck it up and make it very dissonant and nasty sounding. It's a clean guitar sound on that lead there, but the riffs they're playing are so dissonant and clashing. And the guy's doing weird spoken word shit over it. These guys are big on taking various melodies through different rhythmic schemes. For instance, they'll do a lot of weird kind of stop-start stuff like this. It's still that same weird dissonant melody, but being played with a completely different right-hand technique. Then back into this more odd flowing thing with the wacky lead guitar effects. And it starts to lead directly into the song proper by hitting one big massive chord right here. And now we are into the larger song proper. I really like this method of doing intros. It seems like what Pestilence might have been trying to do on their third album, but less weird sound effects and more just like, here's a mini song that introduces ideas that will be explored in the main one. Speaking of Voivod, this album has a lot of very Voivod sounding clean vocals, but even more kind of spaced out and alien in affectation. Also speaking of Voivod, here's some very dissonant stop-start dissonant chord stuff that also utilizes a lot of natural harmonics. Every sort of weird guitar trick in the book happens on this album, and it's all in service to the larger song narrative. Back into this weird, like, needling riff that's actually an echo of what started out as a very clean-sounding riff at the very beginning of the intro track. That's what's called songwriting in the business, folks.
See the difference? Do you see the difference?
So I've mentioned Holy Records a whole lot. Like I said earlier, this album, when it initially came out, Holy Records wasn't a thing yet, but I would say it almost definitely inspired the establishment of that label and that label's sound. So the cool thing about Holy Records is that they're sort of like the Bizarro World version of Nuclear War Now. If you're unfamiliar with the label Nuclear War Now, it was started by a guy named Yusuke, who was really into what we would nowadays call war metal. It's like nasty black metal grindcore mixture. And for years, everything on that label sort of like adhered to a specific sonic profile that he was looking for. Nowadays, he's branched out a little bit, but back in the day, that's the classic Nuclear War Now sound. He even put the words anti-goth before the number of each album, which is sort of a takeoff on how when Euronymous was running Death Like Silence, every CD was labeled Anti-Mosh, which was him getting back at Roadrunner, which labeled every CD as Mosh, because he didn't want any more like moshing, party, happy, fun time, thrash metal shit and metal. Similarly, Yusuke doesn't want any more of this like fruity goth shit and metal. Holy Records could probably slap pro-goth on all their CDs, because despite being like a very avant-garde label, everything else sort of has like a very melodic, melancholic, almost gothic cast to it. And even Supuration, for all their dissonance, are no exception. And actually, I think some of this album's strongest moments come during the very melancholic, consonant melodic bits. For me, the best example of this on record is another 1-2 punch, the shorter kind of intro, mostly instrumental track known as Spherical Inner Sides, which goes into the aptly named The Accomplishment. So Spherical Inner Sides was actually the first Supuration song I ever heard, and it's what made me go through all the trouble of tracking down the Holy Records reissue of this Supuration album back in the day, because I fell in love with this melodic lead guitar line right here. Especially when it's combined with these like very crunchy, almost like Entombed if they were goth style, like melodic rhythm riffs. Awesome stuff. Like if you wanted Entombed to be a little bit more emotionally sensitive, this is the album for you, and I mean that in a good way. And it transitions directly into the longer song proper with a bit of a mood change. That melodic lead guitar is back, but it's considerably more sinister sounding now, The rhythm guitar riffs are no longer that sort of like soulful melancholy. Instead, they're a little bit more threatening sounding. And you get more of these like floating, spacey lead guitar layers. Definitely a lot of like just weird atmospheric layering going on, especially for what's nominally a death metal band. I mean, it's got the growly vocals, right? It's death metal. Here's some more of that weird stop-start bit. Rhythm guitars and drums playing perfectly in sync, suspended with these little note hits in the middle of this like soupy, massive lead guitar. Really strange stuff. And a nice little groove thing to lead you out of the song. That's interesting shit. Elsewhere on the album, they actually synthesized these two approaches, like the very dissonant, nasty, Voivod-y, prog rocky stuff with the more melancholic shit. For instance, on the title track, the Cube, which starts out with this like very harshly truncated guitar line. I'm pretty sure they're doing that with some sort of volume pedal. And it's pretty interesting stuff, but it leads into like the larger part of the intro, which is definitely more towards the heavy dissonant side of the Supuration spectrum, with some very minimalist guitar chugs. Big on groove, big on death metal brutality, even if it's a little bit slower and more melancholic. But now, that same guitar effect is back. It's no longer like a spooky dissonant riff, it has a little bit of a melancholic melody to it. And then the rhythm guitars go into this absolutely beautiful kind of like melodic riff. And that wah pedal comes in. So many cool layers going on. See, this is like very emotional, but not in like sort of like a sappy way. It's just, if you wanted your death metal to be beautiful, this is what it would sound like. This is one of my favorite riffs on the album. This little slidey elision bit here. That's good stuff. Back into, more brutal stuff, because they are still a death metal band. A very weird death metal band, but a death metal band nonetheless. After this album, they would do another EP that continued the style. Then they changed their name to SUP and dropped the death metal shit completely, which was probably a disappointment for some, even if the music was still interesting. But then they actually reformed Supuration while keeping SUP going. So now they have two bands with the same members. SUP leans more heavily avant-garde, Supuration leads more heavily death metal, but they're both still fucking weird, and there's a whole lot of music that they've put out, so if you've liked what you heard so far, check it out, because there's a fucking whole bunch of it for you to listen to. Hope you liked it, and thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye!
Oh, that burns. Ha!